This has the entirety of almost everything. So this is 2.6 terabytes and compressed in a tarball.
So are they saved as MIDI or are they saved as...
Saved as MIDI.
Okay, so recently I saw a TED Talk where a couple of guys seem to have generated every possible melody, or at least every melody that might be sued over in a court of law. And by saving those melodies to a hard drive, they have affixed them to a physical medium, which is all that's necessary to copyright them. In other words, in theory anyway, they have copyrighted every possible melody. Very interesting. I recently got a chance to sit down with them and talk about how they did it and why they did it.
I'm Damien Reel. I'm a lawyer, been a lawyer since 2002. I've also been coding since 1985. I'm also a musician. I have a bachelor's in science in music education.
My name is Noah Rubin, and I'm Damien's collaborator on this project.
So Noah and I were on a cybersecurity engagement. We were talking about this idea of brute forcing music, and I said, Noah, do you think you might be able to brute force, much like a password? Could you also brute force melodies? He's like, yeah, that's a relatively easy technical problem.
We were having drinks one night. He was like, we had talked about this a little bit a while ago. Like, do you really think we could do this? I was like, yeah, cool. That sounds fun. I'll give it a shot.
So in order to brute force a password, you'd use a computer to go through every single permutation of characters possible. In order to brute force melodic copyright, you'd do the same thing. You'd use a computer to generate every single permutation of notes.
The original requirements I'd had is to say, let's do the entire keyboard, from the lowest note all the way to the highest note. Also, every rhythmic variation possible on that.
We went through a number of different parameters, and then we started doing the math and figured out that our original goal of brute forcing all possible melodies is not feasible given the compute infrastructure that we had at the time, which was none, except for the laptop I'm FaceTiming you.
So in order to figure out how many melodies we might generate, you're going to take the total number of pitch classes involved and set that to the power of how many notes you want in your melody.
So if you went 10 notes, you probably 88 to the 10 probably would get you to as many sands of the earth that you would have.
Yeah, it's a very large number, as people in the comments section of the TED Talk were very keen to point out. And that's just with our 12-tone system, never mind alternative tuning systems or anything like that. Forget it.
Thinking as a musician, I thought, okay, do we really need the entire keyboard? No, you probably don't need the entire keyboard, because how many melodies span that much? So you're not going to have a melody that's 3 octaves wide, for example. You're probably going to have something that's singable that's maybe 2 octaves. We did the math in the 2 octaves, and we thought, yeah, that would probably take too long for our proof of concept to be able to do. So we settled ultimately in 1 octave. We'll do do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, 8, and then knowing that a lot of melodies start on the tonic and end on the tonic, whether it's the top tonic or the bottom tonic. So we didn't want to do 7, we wanted to do 8.
We arrived at all quarter notes, 8 notes in middle C, because that's where most popular music is made. And then the length 12 that's what's feasible given the compute that we have. We generated length 12 melodies with those 8 notes in middle C, which comes out to 68.7 billion melodies. And we did that in about 6 days. That was the runtime.
There's a video that VSauce made about 8 years ago asking the question, will we ever run out of new music? They came up with a figure of 78 billion 8-note melodies that span 1 octave that use all 12 tones of the Western equal tempered scale, and suggested that it would take 248 years to exhaust this. It seems like this is a fairly moot point. It already has been exhausted.
Lots of copyright scholars, and I know lots of copyright professors, including some at Cornell and Stanford and otherwise. They've said that this has been a concept that has been discussed conceptually, but never in practice. No one's actually brute forced in this way. What I did find is Peter Berkhamshire, that I mentioned in the TED Talk, he's brute forced chords in the major and minor scales. So I know that he did that in 2017.
Now, is that relevant for copyright law? Because from my understanding, chords are not copyrightable.
I would argue that too. But with the way the courts have gone these days, it's hard to say that definitively. If Groove, under the Marvin Gaye case, if Groove is copyrightable, it's even more out there than a chord being copyrightable.
Now this is interesting. We now have a data set of every possible melody of 12 notes in a major key that span 1 octave, but it seems to me like there's a lot of stuff missing from this. For example, they didn't really consider rhythm at all.
To what extent does the rhythm actually matter versus the changing in pitch? Is the change in pitch really the nature, the DNA of what makes a melody, in its essence, a melody? Oh, won't you stay with me? If you were to say, won't you stay with me? And if I represented Sam Smith, I'd be like, same song.
Okay, I guess that's a fair point if you're arguing this in a court of law. Maybe they are the same melody, I don't know. But what about minor keys? And what about melodies that use non-diatonic tones or melodies which span more than one octave?
Fair to say is that we were solving for the average case, right? So the legal argument we're making and the larger point about society isn't beholden to the fact that we generated this finite data set. We did this with a single server. We've given people the tool to do the same, and it doesn't change the argument that melodies are mathematic.
This is interesting to me because if all copyrightable melodies are simply simple permutations of parameters, then why should any one person own one permutation over another? In other words, nobody can own a number. It's basically all it is. So why should any one person own a melody?
There are only 243 combinations of 3 notes by 5 notes. Do we want to give any one person that happens upon one of those 243 a monopoly for 95 years? Actually, I take that back. Life of the author plus 95 years for something that there are only 243 of in the history of time. For us as a society to give that person a monopoly on that one thing, we have to be pretty sure that that's not going to be to the detriment of everyone else. And we have to know as a society that it's important.
I know that's not normally how people are thinking about melodies and how they might write melodies, but if music is a shared language, owning that granular a piece of the language, I think is equally as ridiculous.
The biggest thing I wanted to, and I hope I got through in the TED Talk, is that I'm not a megalomaniac, and Noah's not a megalomaniac that wants to take over copyright and be able to essentially thrust down your throat, I own the copyright, so screw you. The exact opposite is true. I'm doing this as a means to an end, which is to not have targets on the back of every small musician that could get shaken down by a larger musician that says, hey, your song sounds like my song. If you as a smaller musician have never heard that larger musician's song, you're right now in an untenable position.
If I'm a musician, I should be able to make my music and not have to worry about some song I heard 20 years ago, maybe. I think the idea of independent creation is important, and it's a bit under attack.
What do we as musicians want to be able to mark as our territory, that this is my creative thing that I put out into the world, and I don't want anybody else in the world to be able to do this creative thing I've done? All the things that we as musicians love about music is not the sequence of pitches.
And yet, in recent court cases, it seems like the sequence of pitches has actually mattered quite a lot to judges and juries determining whether or not one song has infringed on another song's copyright. Melodies aren't the only thing that matter, though, in these cases. Another important thing to consider is the question of access. Whether or not one artist heard the other artist's copyrighted work. It's entirely possible that they didn't.
Under the copyright law, theoretically at least, you could independently come up with a melody, and I could independently come up with the same melody, and under the law, at least in theory, we can both independently create the same thing, and we could both have rights to that thing.
So where does that leave this data set that Noah and Damien have created of every possible melody?
So we're putting everything up on archive.org. It's freely available to anybody.
We put everything in the public domain, including both the data set and the program, in a way to be able to be both transparent and to be able to let other people do what we're doing.
I'd like to also focus on getting people to realize that this stuff is freely available. And once we do so, establish some sort of demand, I would love to just continue to keep this running and at a certain point have a more sizable set of melodies.
In the infamous Katy Perry versus Flame lawsuit, where she was sued for her song Dark Horse's resemblance to Flame's song Joyful Noise, the jury found that she had access to Joyful Noise, even though she testified that she had never heard the song before in her life. The jury didn't believe that Katy Perry independently created Dark Horse without ever hearing Joyful Noise. The rationale provided for this is that the music video for Joyful Noise had, at the time, 3 million views on YouTube. In other words, that seems to be the threshold for determining access. 3 million views on YouTube. So, where I'm headed with this, if the combined view count of this video and Damien's TED Talk exceeds 3 million views, maybe that's enough for establishing access. And since all of the melodies and the tools for creating all of the melodies are public domain, maybe, just maybe, any melody written after today will have to prove that they didn't have access to this video, which is incredibly difficult to do. I don't know, the whole system's screwed anyway, so why not just approach it this way, like kind of a troll strategy? As a musician, I don't feel particularly protected under copyright law. I feel rather threatened, in fact. And so throwing a wrench in the whole process through this whole generative melody thing, I think ultimately is a good thing for the craft of musical composition.
By framing the issue this way, by saying there are only so many notes, here they are here, that TED Talk might actually make its way to judges that then might be able to decide the access thing in a better way.
Also, to anybody who is a lawyer in the space listening, which I really hope they are, please, please, please take this argument, if you believe in it, and give it a shot. I think that's the most important thing.